please join me now in welcoming Mark to Ariba Live.
Thanks, Rachel. Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. As Rachel mentioned, my name is Mark Loring, and I'm responsible for source-to-pay operations at Deutsche Bank. It's a pleasure to be here to share a little bit about the journey that we've been through, which I think will have some interesting relevance and applicability to, I'm sure, some of the challenges that many of you are facing. I think the video and also the screen that you'll see behind you highlights some of the key facts and figures around Deutsche Bank in terms of scale, complexity, and coverage. But one of the interesting factors in terms of the growth of the bank has really been how we've also grown through acquisition. Postbank and Sal. Oppenheim in Germany, Bankers Trust in the US, ABN AMRO in the Netherlands, as well as Morgan Grenfell. And the interesting thing, each of these institutions was very diverse in their own right, in terms of their operating model, the culture, the policies, and the processes that they ran by. And as you think about, from a source-to-pay operations perspective, providing a global service to all of these very diverse organizations was clearly something that was challenging. So in terms of our journey, like many organizations, we came from a legacy of a very highly localized accounts payable model, typically in a regional finance organization. And then in 2004, we're really a very early adopter, particularly in the financial services area, to look at outsourcing as really a strategic lever. So we chose a partner to work with, and then went through a very significant program of initially lifting and shifting a lot of those activities to 3 main core offshore centers. And that really enabled us to drive that first phase of significant operational efficiency, which we were then able to reinvest those resources into the strategic sourcing area, into a lot of that white space that we had typically been challenging to get into in terms of a resource perspective. The next step was really an interesting one and pretty revolutionary, which was working with our external partner to really build the first of its kind, which was really a totally new external platform to run that service from. It was a great idea. I think we, from a DB perspective, didn't necessarily execute in the best way in terms of really looking at standardizing and harmonizing those processes, those policies, and those cultural aspects that I mentioned earlier. So what we ended up creating was something that was a little complicated and inflexible from an agility perspective. So we then took the decision, again, with our partner, to really take a look at replatforming. And this is really where the Ariba story starts. We chose an Ariba on-premise solution. And also, critically, we chose to fundamentally change our entire approach. So we formed user interest groups, client engagement activities, and really tried to bring the bank with us as we drove the change, really making people feel like they were part of the journey versus being forced upon them. This was incredibly successful in terms of both the outcome from a standardized platform perspective and the sense of ownership from a deployment perspective within the business lines. It enabled us to rapidly increase purchase order coverage from what had been below 10% up to 70%, and as was mentioned in the VC, leveraged the Ariba network heavily to drive e-invoicing up to close to 70%, which is pretty good, I think, for any industry, but certainly good from a financial services perspective. And critically, this is really the foundation of where we are today. It really offers us a seat at the table because at the end of the day, from a purchasing and accounts payable perspective and an overall source-to-pay perspective, we need to prove we can deliver. And what you don't want to be doing is fielding questions around payment issues, process issues, performance issues. So we were live in our 10 major countries. We were meeting all of our key SLAs, straight-through processing, payment on time, and really starting to build the credibility with the organization so that we could start engaging in those strategic conversations around business drivers and category planning. Then last year, interestingly, we first foray really into the on-demand world. So we launched the e-sourcing suite on-demand and really started the evolution of our thinking around what a hybrid strategy could look like. So being able to leverage the very best capabilities that the on-demand suite could offer, but integrate that with our on-premise procure-to-pay solution. And that was hugely successful, both in terms of the outcomes and the solution and the functionality we delivered, but also critically the speed of delivery that on-demand can offer with capabilities like that. We've currently got a very large number of initiatives in flight, so we've just launched Ariba Services Procurement, and I'll talk a lot more about that later because it's an absolutely critical backbone to some of the things that we're working on. We're in the process of launching a new contract management solution and really harmonizing all of the contracts that we have across the bank into a single repository, building the metadata and the quality of the reporting and analytics that we need around that. And excitedly, building on the on-demand story, we've just gone live with our first location with a full source-to-pay suite in Italy. So this is really our first foray into full transactional processing in an on-demand environment. And we really need to continue to build and understand what the scalable approach to that would be longer term, and I'll talk again a little bit more about that later. Now, in terms of the journey, an interesting organizational aspect certainly when I came into the bank is that we had a strategic sourcing organization full of category directors that were used to dealing with multi-million euro, big ticket, particularly complex service type arrangements, and then we had a legacy accounts payable organization. We really had a fundamental gap around what I would call operational procurement capability, which is really about taking those contracts, those strategic partnerships, and actually understanding from a user perspective and a client perspective how the business lines want to interact with those contracts and putting the procurement process into the user's hand to drive the right level of compliance. And that's really something that we've built upon and developed that capability significantly. Simple things like catalog content management, and there's no point in having the world's greatest e-procurement solution if you're not actually building the quality of content and thinking about things in it from a user's perspective. So where are we today? I mean, for any organization, particularly for a purchasing organization, mandates and then relevance to corporate priorities are clearly key. And there's really been a huge shift within Deutsche Bank in the last 12 to 18 months that really you can take a look at the services that the source-to-pay organization and the platform provides and really understand how they're a key enabler to many of the key corporate initiatives and priorities that we have. So Deutsche Bank, like many organizations, has got a significant focus on driving culture, values, and change across the bank. And whilst this is clearly focused heavily on the client side, the revenue side, it's equally applicable as you think about cost discipline and you think about the relevance around source to pay, and we also are responsible for the T&E platform in the bank, and making sure that we're really visibly demonstrating the right degree of controls and governance over those processes and highlighting good behaviors and so forth across the bank. So that's critical. Next one is regulatory environment, which is, for a truly global bank, we're dealing with regulators in every market, and it's incredibly complicated with the requirements that those regulators have upon us. But interestingly, it's been a driver to how we've started to think about moving what was from a procure to pay and a sourcing world into truly an integrated source to pay environment, and really being able to take the transactional world that we have and the contract management and strategic sourcing world and bring those together. We have a much higher degree of focus of understanding where our risks are in terms of, again, the services that are provided and really being able to prove that we can manage those risks appropriately. And in particular, as you think about contract compliance and really the ability to prove that you are seeing spend and seeing at an invoice level spend mapped against those contracts, which sounds easy, but if you've got multiple global contracts that you're transacting in 70 different markets, it's a little more complicated than just a one-to-one relationship. Finally, from a corporate priorities perspective, we've got our operational excellence initiative, which is really all about driving 4.5 billion of cost reductions across the bank. Now, purchasing is usually a pretty popular group when there's a major cost reduction activity underway. The major change here, from a mindset perspective, is really the word sustainable. And so really, for the first time, we are trying to map through from a contract negotiation perspective to ensure that we're driving compliance to that contract, but then also understanding where in the P&L the savings related to that contract should be appearing, and therefore adjusting budgets accordingly. And that's critical for us, as we're terming it P&L effectiveness, but really driving sustainable savings. The other aspect of operational excellence that's really enabling us, particularly in the services space, is the whole concept of target operating model. So for the first time, the bank's really taking appropriate action around what work and accountabilities really belong where within the organization. And it's allowing us to have those conversations where there may be duplication, where there may be outliers, again, to driving that next level of standardization. So to grasp the opportunity, a new organization was formed, which took what was the legacy global purchasing organization and a finance infrastructure function and brought them together. And rather than simply bring them together under a new leader, the decision was made to really take a step back and really understand what are our objectives as we think about what we're terming primary cost management, which is really around ensuring we understand where cost is incurred and managing that cost appropriately, versus what a lot of organizations get into, which is sometimes a conversation around allocated costs versus actually the real primary cost. So again, the organization was designed very much with those objectives in mind, and then understanding what processes we needed to back up in order to meet those objectives. So as you move from the left-hand side across, you've really got cost planning for the bank in terms of managing investment governance, policies, and the focus here isn't just on the 10 billion external costs that we have within the bank. It's actually on the full 23 billion cost base that we have, so it includes all of our comp and FTE costs as well. The next silo is the classical purchasing and sourcing organizations where the category teams sit, the deals are done, where the contracts are managed and the vendor risk is managed. In the middle is our organisation, so from a source-to-pay perspective, which is really we're responsible then from a governance and a controls perspective, and really ensuring we've got the enabling processes in place, again, to act as the glue between the cost plan, the budget, and those contracts that we have. The next piece is account and report, which is really all around getting one single set of good quality numbers that the bank operates on. So again, rather than getting into conversations around people having duplicate sets of numbers and what the actual difference between those data is, it's about ensuring that we have one set of reliable numbers across the bank. Finally, and critically for us, is stakeholder management, and this is absolutely key. So this is really, again, around partnering with the business, understanding where their business strategies are going, and ensuring then we understand what the cost drivers behind those business strategies are, and we're looping that back and really from an end-to-end perspective, ensuring that as we grow and evolve and develop, that budgets are catching up and the cost plans are catching up and the relevance there. So let me talk a little bit more about the actual intervention that's underway around primary cost management. So as I mentioned earlier, we're at 70% purchase order coverage, which we were feeling pretty good about, particularly from a financial services perspective. But interestingly, we'd taken a classical purchasing view, which was we were really looking at what we deemed to be sourceable spend. We weren't looking at the true external cost base of the bank. So we'd been looking at a baseline of between 7 or 8 billion, when actually the cost base of the bank was about 10 billion from an external spend perspective. And so from a mandate perspective, we needed to widen our coverage and ensure, again, we had the right processes in place around that. The next piece was then, apart from widening scope, was also actually toughening the rules and really moving from just measuring whether someone's got a purchase order to really defining by cost category what the optimum and therefore compliant purchasing channel is. I think we've all seen cases and examples in, I'm sure, all of your organizations where just because you have a purchase order doesn't mean it's compliant. You have some business consulting engagement, the engagement's started or even finished in many cases. Someone's got an invoice and they need to pay it, so they then go and create a purchase order. So clearly from a principles perspective, that isn't really adhering to the principles of what we're actually trying to achieve. Interestingly, as we adjusted and took these new rules into account, we actually dropped from 70% purchase order coverage by transaction to about 40 to 45% coverage in terms of what we really deemed to be the optimal process. So we had some work to do. The interesting thing as we talk about process, and really a real mantra from our CFO is around treating money like it's your own. And fundamental to that is really around checking you've got it before you go and commit or spend it, which I think is a good one that we'd all agree with. And so key to this is ensuring we've got the right level of approval prior to a commitment or a spend. And what we've done is we've really extended what was a very successful no PO, no pay strategy in the bank to no budget, no PO, no PO, no pay. So again, ensuring that we've got that additional level of control. And this has been key as you think about leveraging the power of the new organization, because what it really talks about is having a cost plan at the right level for the cost categories that we want to manage, ensuring that we're then booking actuals, again, into that same common structure. We understand what our commitments are, and then you've got a very simple equation as to whether you have money or you don't. And that is driving a significant amount of activity for us at the moment. So how are we driving this? So the good news is over the last 6 to 9 months, we've gone from what was about 40 to 45%, and we're now at about 75%. We're on our way to a journey of a stretch goal by the end of this year of 95%. Now, critical to this, again, as I mentioned earlier, has been mandates. So we've got group operating committee visibility. We produce scorecards on a quarterly basis for each member on that committee, which really fits with their business responsibilities and the business lines that they're managing. And critical to that has been not just the scorecard, but actually what's the aligned plan? What are we working with each of those business lines on? Because we have 70% of what we buy are complex services. And I'm not just talking about IT services or business consulting, but it's things like advisory services, fund management, commission payments, insurance. It's lots of things that don't necessarily easily fit on a simple purchase order. So we're really needing to work with those business lines, understand the profile of the spend. Now, critical to the success here of this program has really been around the launch of Ariba Services Procurement. It's a key enabler to being able to adjust and leverage the template capabilities that the product has to really meet a lot of those complex requirements. Fundamentally, the other thing that we're, back to the target operating model conversation that I mentioned earlier, which is what we're trying to do as well is make the right process easy and the wrong process more difficult. What we've typically done, and I'm sure what a lot of organizations do, is people layer on degrees of control or pseudo-control to the right process, which ends up making that far more painful than just completely bypassing it and getting an invoice that you need to pay. And so what we've done is we've really gone out there and really started, again, leveraging the platform and really started to challenge the organizations to understand what the real business requirements are and try and harmonize those and bring them into the standard buying platform. There was about 30 plus of these, pre-approval tools and shadows. A good example was in the IT space. I think we all know that IT organizations are good at building their own tools, where they'd created a portfolio management and budget management capability which had 13 levels of pre-approval before you even got to the point of creating a purchase requisition. And when you actually lifted the covers and started to understand what they were trying to achieve, so much of that was duplicative. The people making the decisions didn't necessarily have the right information to make the decision anyway. So we've brought that to a single standard platform. We've now got about 4 or 5 levels of approval within that platform. We've got the right people making the right decisions with the right information. So what's next? So the organization and obviously the platform strategy is going to continue to evolve. We've got an ever-increasing and demanding set of business requirements across the bank. The regulatory requirements are continuing to evolve and getting tougher. What we're going to need to do is to continue to understand how we can leverage the hybrid approach and really understand how we can leverage the very best in functionality and capability that's out there and critically deploy that functionality and that capability as quickly as we possibly can. So again, we're really looking at further evolution of the hybrid solution, the on-premise and the on-demand working in Key. One of the key aspects of this that I'm certainly interested in getting more information on while we're here this week is the concept of all spend in Ariba, because there are clearly outliers if you think of legal spend and you think of market data services and other areas of spend that we have, and really understanding what some of those offerings might be. Temp labor is another good example. Another interesting part of the strategy, things like vendor master data sounds pretty tactical, but again, as you think about the true source-to-pay environments and really being able to link a contract environment with a complex transactional environment in multiple countries, you need to plan and understand how you can optimize things like vendor master. So again, that's a key area of challenge for us as we go forward. So I mentioned Italy is our first live on-demand transactional system. The great news there is it took us just 5 months of incredibly hard work. I'm sure there's some people in the audience that could relate to that, but we were live from start to finish in 5 months, and we've got capabilities in that on-demand solution that we don't yet have in our on-premise environment, again, because of the agility and flexibility around there. We're also being able to leverage new capabilities like non-release contracts, which again for us, as you think of things like commission payments, is absolutely key. Because in some cases, we're not actually sure how much it's going to cost, who's going to pay for it, and in some cases even who we're actually buying it from right until the point where the deal is made. But we can leverage the non-release contract to put a far more controlled process, far more efficient and effective process in place, which is absolutely key for us. So we're looking forward to proving the on-demand solution and then rapidly deploying to another dozen countries later this year. In terms of the on-demand, one of the other things, there's a perceived or real, in some cases, concern from a regulatory perspective around the concepts of cloud computing and on-demand. And we are going to need to continue to work together on that, absolutely. So in summary, we certainly believe we've come a long way. We're proud of where we've come. We've worked very hard partnering with both our BPO partner and with Ariba in terms of really trying to drive some significant areas of innovation in some very complex areas. But those complex challenges are just going to continue. So I think life's certainly going to get an awful lot more interesting for us ahead. So hopefully some of this was relevant, some of this was of interest to some of the challenges that you're facing out there. And thanks very much for your time.